Morning, everybody. Good morning and very warm welcome to this webinar on conservation grazing and the Common Agricultural Policy. And a special welcome to our two distinguished speakers. My name is Henk Singstra and I'm the chair of the Eurosite Management Expert Group of Eurosite. And in case you don't know Eurosite, Eurosite is a network organization of organizations and individuals interested and involved in protected area management. And Eurosite's goal is to increase competencies in conservation. And we do that, among others, by organizing study tours, organizing trainings, exchange visits, and webinars like this one. And one of our aims is also to bridge the gap between science and conservation practice. The Eurosite Management Expert Group is, among others, responsible for the management toolkit, which provides information on on issues that site managers encounter when managing their protected area. I will come back on that later. And grazing is a subject our working group has been active in recently, and we are about to upload a guidance document on conservation grazing. And also the recordings of this webinar will be included in our toolkit. I guess we have all noticed that the number of grazing animals has increased significantly in recent years in conservation, especially since the rewilding approach has become more popular. But do these grazing activities help to achieve our goals? And what is known about the long-term impact of introduced animals on biodiversity, but also on organic soil matter, and thus on climate change? What impact do sheep, horses and cows have on the vegetation and on ground breeders? And what is the best grazing pressure? And do we go for all year-round grazing or just seasonal grazing? These and other questions will be discussed during a number of events that Eurosite is about to organize. There will be two webinars, this one on conservation grazing and the Common Agricultural Policy, and there will be one on the 27th of September with a focus on management experiences of species-rich grassland in Central and Eastern Europe. And in the spring of 2023, there will be a study tour during which we will visit various grazing sites in the Netherlands. And a follow-up study tour will be organized in the fall of 2023 to sites in Poland. Grazing is also seen as an ideal management tool to restore biodiversity in previously intensively used agricultural lands. And this is especially relevant in view of the EU Nature Restoration Law. And that brings us to the question, what is the relation between conservation grazing and extensive farming? And this question will be the subject of today's webinar, for which we have invited two distinguished speakers. And we will start with an introduction into the scientific aspects of conservation grazing by Dr. Julia Rouet-Leduc. And Julia is a doctoral researcher at the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. Her PhD takes an interdisciplinary approach to explore different types of grazing and the ecosystem services they provide. Her project, GrazeLife, is coordinated by Rewilding Europe and part of an EU Life preparatory project. In her research, she seeks to identify good grazing practices for multiple ecosystem services, as well as how to incentivize these for land users. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I hope you can see my screen. Thanks a lot for the introduction and hello everyone. So as you mentioned, I'm a PhD student at IDIV, and today I'm going to talk about sustainable grazing in the context of conservation grazing in this webinar today. So you just gave a little bit of context about my project, Graze Life, which was coordinated by Rewilding Europe, where we seek to compare different types of grazing and the ecosystem services they can provide. And to do that, we've mostly been working on extensive literature reviews, and we also had 8 case studies in different parts of Europe in areas that had different socioeconomic and climatic contexts. And we at IDIV were the scientific partners of this project. So how this project came about and the reason for it is grazing is an important nature conservation tool, and it has the potential to provide multiple ecosystem services. And as we can see in Europe now, there is a dual trend, both of a land abandonment process that is going on with up to 1 million hectares a year that are being abandoned, and it's often areas with environmental constraints, and it has consequences on ecosystem services, and it often causes large-scale shrub encroachment in these areas and the disappearance of mosaic landscapes that provide multiple ecosystem services, and also in this case an increased fire risk. And in parallel to this trend of agricultural land abandonment, there is also agricultural intensification. So with that in mind, we know that grazing, when done right, can contribute to multiple ecosystem services, which is what I'm going to talk about today to start with. And then I'm going to talk about another important question is what drives land users to conduct these good practices of using sustainable grazing, which is grazing that provides multiple ecosystem services. And we're going to talk about how grazing can provide carbon sequestration and storage, moderation of extreme events, amongst other wildfires, habitats for biodiversity, but also cultural ecosystem services and more. So to start with, as we know, grazing has multiple impact on biodiversity, and this is through multiple mechanisms that herbivores have in the landscapes, which is selective grazing, defoliation, trampling, seed dispersal, but also accidental predation, for example, of insects and so on, and also through the features they create in the landscapes with trails, wallowing sites, and so on. And what we found through our studies is that extensive forms of grazing can have a positive impact on biodiversity in many respects. It can often create and maintain a mosaic of grazed and ungrazed patches, which increases biodiversity, also through the mechanisms I just mentioned before, and also through the features that the animals are creating in the landscapes that creates very different habitats. However, we also know that too high densities of animals tend to graze unselectively and create too high disturbances. They create bare patches, risk of erosion, a lot more accidental predation, and this has a negative impact. And we see often that it has more of a negative impact on arthropod diversity. And also some practices that are often associated with domestic and often intensive grazing practices are detrimental to biodiversity. And that is, for example, deworming medicine, parasiticide medicines that are given to animals that have non-targeted effects in the environment, even for weeks after application. Mostly it affects dung-eating animals, but also bigger animals, such as the predators like birds or other vertebrates. So we also know that grazing management can have an impact on climate change mitigation and carbon sequestration. And here, the evidence on grazing, and in this case, soil organic carbon, is mixed, and it depends very often on grazing intensity and also other environmental parameters like climate parameters. And even if the evidence is mixed, we do know that intensive grazing almost always reduces the amount of soil organic carbon in the soil when compared to extensive practices or non-grazed areas or even mowing. Then another ecosystem service that was especially important in our study because it's considered a very high priority topic is the impact of large herbivores of grazing on wildfire prevention and the potential of using grazing as a tool for preventing and mitigating wildfires. So we do know that grazing and browsing can prevent fuel buildup, and it can create fire breaks and fuel breaks in the landscapes, and that both reintroducing grazers through, for example, through rewilding projects in areas that are maybe abandoned, or encouraging existing pastoral or grazing practices through payment for ecosystem services are mechanisms that work well to create fire breaks and fuel breaks, especially in areas that are maybe hard to access for mechanical clearing or controlled burning, which are other fire prevention methods, or maybe in areas that are close to urban areas, where it's maybe easier to work with animals who tend to have a quite high acceptability in a lot of areas. And one thing that is very important to think about when using grazers for fire prevention, but also for the provision of multiple other ecosystem services, is to adapt the type of animal to the environment and to the vegetation present. In this case, if you want to work on fuel reduction, it's important to think about what type of vegetation and what type of grazing habits the animals have. And these are some results from one of our literature reviews. And we can see that often animals that are more browsing animals, such as goats, they may be more effective at reducing vegetation biomass than, for example, strict grazers like cattle that in some cases can graze only selectively on grassy vegetation, and in some cases even cause recruitment of woody vegetation. So both for fire prevention and for other ecosystem services, thinking about the type of animal matching the vegetation is very important. And in some cases, using mixed flocks with different animals that have different grazing habits can be interesting. And it can also be interesting from a parasite control point of view, since often parasites or worms that affect one species don't necessarily transfer to the other one. So it's always an interesting option to look at. So another very important one when talking about ecosystem services are cultural ecosystem services, since we know that different types of grazing can provide multiple cultural ecosystem services, landscape aesthetics, opportunities for recreation and ecotourism, a strong sense of place and tradition. So we find that there's a lot of extensive grazing systems and pastoral grazing systems that are associated with very strong sense of place, tradition. For example, in the Mediterranean areas, these Montado de Hesa systems or the bocage in France, for example, they have a very strong aesthetics, and they can often provide opportunities for ecotourism and agritourism, sales of local products, and so on. And on the other hand, landscapes that are grazed more by semi-wild grazers and that are more what we would qualify as maybe rewilding projects, rewilding areas, they have a very different type of aesthetics, of more wild natures with presence of charismatics, maybe unusual animals, which are also providing multiple opportunities for recreation and ecotourism, but that in some cases can also be challenging if you think of rewilding projects that are maybe done on former abandoned agricultural land that have also a very strong aesthetics, and it brings something very different to the table. So to summarize what I've just talked about grazing and ecosystem services, I think having given you an overview, it's important to think about the fact that there is no one size fits all grazing management, and it's always very context dependent, whether it is the type of animal that fits into the landscapes or the type of grazing density that fits in a certain environment. And what we find is that there is often a type of management that provides multiple ecosystem services through extensive grazing. But if you think about how to choose a type of management, it's interesting to think about what type of management provides multiple ecosystem services and not focus on one. For example, if you take the example of wildfire prevention, it's often that the highest grazing density, the better, because then you create real proper fuel breaks that are maybe without any vegetation, which is good for fire prevention, but then also maybe also creates bare patches and erosion issues and so on. So beyond knowing exactly what kind of grazing practices provide the most ecosystem services, it is useful to also explore how to incentivize these practices and what are the main challenges for land users to practice this conservation grazing, and what are the main decision-making factors for land users to adapt these kind of practices. So now I'm gonna take you through the second part of my talk, which was interviews conducted within Graze Life project. So we conducted almost 100 interviews with land users that were mostly working with extensive grazing practices or semi-wild grazing practices across different areas in Europe. And we focused then on decision-making drivers, challenges, and incentives for practicing sustainable grazing. And what we found some important elements that were contributing to their decision-making was to start with socioeconomic aspects. So a supporting social context, a supporting social environment was very important to them. In a lot of areas, land users struggled with rural depopulation, rural exodus, abandonment of traditional agricultural activity, sometimes challenges to find workforce that was willing to work and take care of agricultural jobs. So that was a very important element. And then there was another important aspect, which was tradition and heritage. A lot of these extensive grazing practices, or maybe associated to like pastoral practices and so on, were anchored in very strong cultural identity and tradition that had been very present in communities. And that was often a reason for land users to continue with this, just to perpetuate the tradition. And then another interesting decision-making drivers for land users that we thought was interesting was the care for nature. So there was often a willingness to do good management and seeing the intrinsic value of nature and just wanting to do good management for nature. And that was, of course, modulated by the opportunities and challenges provided by the landscapes and the access to resources, the remoteness of the areas, the access to water, and so on. And another thing that was especially important for land users that were more practicing very extensive grazing or almost semi-wild forms of grazing is the risk of land use conflicts, maybe with animals that are not as tame as traditional domestic cattle or animals that were breaking fences or escaping and maybe not as easy to manage as normal animals and could cause conflicts with either neighbors or people that were walking by and so on. And that was an important challenge. And finally, another very important element, and my colleague Guy will give you a lot more information about this in his talk in a few minutes, an enabling policy environment and access to economic support was very important, both in terms of income and in terms of access to subsidies. And that was, of course, influencing a lot the practices that the land users were conducting, and it was weighing a lot in their decisions. And there was also the aspect of the administrative burden that was necessary when conducting their activity of very extensive grazing or semi-wild grazing, where a lot of land users felt like there was a lot of administrative rules that were sometimes incoherent with the management that they believed were the best, or some rules that were making it challenging for them to conduct semi-wild grazing practices, for example, related to earmarking of animals or veterinary inspections and so on, when animals were more grazing quite far away from the farm and so on. So this was just a short overview of the main results from all these interviews with land users. And if we want to summarize the takeaway messages from my talk about sustainable grazing in the context of conservation grazing, is that we saw that it can provide a cost-effective way to manage landscapes and provide multiple ecosystem services, including habitat for biodiversity, carbon capture, wildfire mitigation, cultural ecosystem services, and more. And that it's very important to take in consideration context, both environmental and socioeconomic, and to adapt the type of grazing density and the type of animal to specific local contexts. And also it's important to take in consideration the main challenges that can be faced by individual land users, from what we have found of challenges related to land use conflicts, human-wildlife conflicts, and the challenges related to rural depopulation and land abandonment, and challenges related to rules and regulations on livestock grazing that were preventing certain activities linked to conservation grazing. And with this conclusion, I want to thank you for listening to me today. And of course, thanks my colleagues that have contributed to these studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks a lot. It's very interesting to see also, to look at conservation grazing from the perspective of the land user or the farmer, and to see what challenges there are and what obstacles, especially these land users encounter when wanting to extensify their land use. There is already a question in the Q&A, but it's from Bill Grayson. What are the negative effects of extensive grazing on biodiversity? I would like to leave that question to our final discussion. It's a very good one. So I would like to continue first with the presentation of Dr. Guy PR. Dr. Guy is also a researcher at the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, and also of the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, the Department of Ecosystem Services. Guy was also involved in the Graze Life project, but he is also engaged in interdisciplinary research into how EU's common agriculture policy affects both humans and nature. He's particularly interested in how the CAP affects socio-economic systems in terms of interactions between farm structure and economy. And he is looking at the structure of economy, biodiversity, policies, and ecosystem services, and consequently also in the rural vitality and farmers' well-being. Guy, the floor is yours. Please present your presentation.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me, and thank you very much also for attending this talk today and this webinar. So in my presentation, I would like to continue directly from the science which was presented by Julia now, and the complexity of the science around grazing in general and conservation grazing in particular. And I want to focus on the common agricultural policy as a mechanism which could or may be used to support conservation grazing. And I'm going to explore the question to which extent we're managing to do so. So just to summarize shortly those challenges which were already presented by Julia in order to put them into the framework that I'm going to talk about, we've seen that there are a set of challenges both for the grazers, the animals, but also for the people, the land users and land managers that are engaged in grazing or trying to achieve conservation grazing for either climate purposes, biodiversity purposes, or other issues. And we have been seeing repeatedly through the GrazeLife interviews as well as other assessments that basically there's a problem of insufficient support, including funding for extensive grazing. There are many administrative burdens, including eligibility criteria, controls, sanctions, but also conflicts with forestry or other types of farming. Particularly from an economic perspective, it is pretty intuitive. There's a very difficult situation for a person who's trying to manage extensive grazing compared to having lots of animals in a given area. So from an economic perspective, there's already a challenge built in when trying to employ extensive grazing. And from the animals' perspective, there's also the question of how to achieve those levels of grazing that we are intended to achieve, and with which animals. There's a problem of rarity of real grazers in our ecosystems, especially in Europe. They're mostly extinct. Most of these animals are no longer there. Or because of policies and regulations, animals are often excluded, for instance, from forest areas if we want to restore the forest, and from forestation areas or forestry areas, animals are actually excluded in order to allow recovery. And this is actually a problem both for the animals, but also in, for instance, creating enhanced risks for fires. So the questions are basically, how do we resolve these challenges, and what are the roles of the different policies we have? And here the common agricultural policy, being almost 40% of the EU budget, is the key mechanism that is possible to use for these purposes. If anything, because this is the largest funding mechanism for biodiversity and climate purposes. And this is also declared as such by the European Commission and the Parliament. So when we're talking about the larger areas and the larger budgets allocated by the EU to grasslands, to grazing, or to other purposes, then the common agricultural policy is the first place to examine. To make sure we are all on the same page, it's important to realize what are the key instruments in the common agricultural policy, or the CAP, within this amount of budget. So the most famous ones, of course, are agro-environment climate schemes or measures, marked here as AECM, with about 4.5 billion euros allocated yearly, including within Natura 2000 areas and payments for organic farming. These are not 100% the same definitions, and there are different sub-mechanisms within the CAP. We should not forget that there's also cross-compliance. There are basic standards that farmers have to comply with, including the amount of non-productive areas or the amount of animals that can be allowed in a given area, which is part of agro-environment schemes. And since 2013, we also have greening, so measures to either support permanent pastures, farm diversification in arable areas, or ecological focus areas. These are the three greening measures. But we need to look at all that within a broader framework of what greening is trying to green. And the main point to recall is that the CAP is first of all an instrument for supporting farming and farmers, not necessarily wild animals or other purposes, but first and foremost supporting farmers. And the biggest mechanism to do that is direct payments. These are payments per hectare for farmers for being farmers. And this is a valuable instrument also for people who are engaged in extensive farming. They have been reporting that this is an important mechanism also for them. There's also Pillar 2 with less money in it for rural development, and it includes a range of different instruments. Some of them are pro-environment, others have other purposes, including investments for intensification. And one important instrument that I will come back to soon is areas of nature constraints, which are important, particularly in remote areas or inaccessible areas, for instance, where farmers are often really struggling also from an economic perspective. And land users engaged in grazing also mention also this instrument. However, despite the fact that the Common Agricultural Policy is a key instrument which could address these challenges, de facto we see that it doesn't succeed. And this is not to say the CAP is the cause of that. There are many reasons why farmers are intensifying their management or why we are losing the farmers. But in general, what we're seeing throughout Europe is a decline in many different indices of biodiversity, such as farmland bird index declining here for all parts of Europe, but particularly so for the new member states in red here. And we see on the right side the failure to address greenhouse gas emissions. We see that they are reducing for the EU level in yellow here, but they are stagnant and even increasing in some years for agricultural areas. In particular, this is related to bovine cattle herds and to nitrogen fertilizers. So we're talking really about grazing and particularly conventional intensive grazing, which is one of the factors that are preventing us from addressing greenhouse gas emissions, which are very important, of course, if you want to address the climate crisis. Staggeringly, the farmers are also not benefiting sufficiently from the Common Agricultural Policy. Here in this figure, you could see the different sizes of farms in Northwestern Europe, Southern Europe, and in Central and East Europe. And what we can see is a decline in the number of farmers, so in terms of employment. These are numbers merely for 8 years. Between 2005 and 2013, we have been losing about 3.5 million farmers and having seen only a small increase in the number of large-scale farming, basically. So a small number of people and organizations or companies are taking over, and many are the losers. And a system which is based on payment per hectare, and where 1.5% of beneficiaries receive 32% of the payments, or almost 80% are receiving nearly 20% of the money, with less than 5,000 euros a year. Obviously, this is not succeeding in halting the loss of farmers in this system. So we are seeing major problems of generation renewal and lack of will to be engaged in farming, partly because the money does not go to where it needs to go. Now we need to talk about the consequences of a 3.5-year process of the CAP reform, starting already in 2017 with a range of different consultation processes and ending with an official proposal, which was then decided after long trilogue negotiations. This is based on a graphic which is typically shown also by the European Commission, where on one side we see the CAP as it is now with agro-environmental measures, greening and cross-compliance, then there's a division, and as of 2023 we will have a certain change. We see that there will be actually less budget for Pillar 2 unless member states are shifting the money into Pillar 1. But on the other hand, the most important change is a decision to take those elements of greening, which has seen a lot of resistance from farmers because these are compulsory, and putting them where they actually should be, at least from an intuitive perspective, they should be under enhanced conditionality. So there's an expansion of the requirements for good standards. On the other hand, there's establishment of new measures, which are eco schemes. They are compulsory for member states, but voluntary for farmers. This means that, in fact, we have introduced agro-environment climate measures in Pillar 1. They are simpler, they are annual, but they have the same approach of allowing farmers to be motivated, and for farmers that want to go the extra mile, as they call it, beyond conditionality, they will get support in doing so. So this is one element which is really important, but we need to recall that in addition to these elements, there are actually a plethora of different instruments which could be used for the purpose of environmental instrumentation, including the payments for areas facing nature constraints. Non-productive investments are very important for habitat restoration, but there's also knowledge support, which is extremely important for farmers, especially if it's done right. You could also see that I painted it in gray, and this is because it's really a question of how member states are using these instruments. Payments for areas of nature constraints are particularly mixed in terms of some member states taking them and using them effectively for farmers that really need that in high nature value farmland areas, and other member states are simply using that for intensification. So it's ranging between a harmful subsidy and a useful subsidy, but there's no evaluation of their use. The same goes for investments, which could go for intensification or restoration, and knowledge which is not supported by ecological background, which often goes into intensification. So the question is, how can we make it deliver for conservation grazing, for extensive grazing, for environmental goals in general? And grazing here is very central because of the win-win opportunities for climate, for biodiversity, soil, etc., in a system of general collapse. Now here, the other issue that has been updated in the CAP is a set of official objectives as articulated in Articles 5 and 6 of the CAP. So what we are seeing now is 9 different objectives. 3 of them are environmental, 3 address social issues, and 3 are addressing economic issues, exactly as we would expect if we are looking at the dimensions of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental. And we are seeing objectives for climate, for environment, and biodiversity, including also soil and other environmental aspects. However, we still also have the official CAP objectives as set in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, defined already in 1962. So whenever there's a problem for member states or a conflict between objectives, member states always refer back to the official objectives and say, well, we have to prioritize on those objectives, and they have to do with food security, with production or productivity, standards of living for agricultural community, stabilizing markets, whatever that means nowadays, in terms of globalization and the single individuals, availability of supplies. We're constantly hearing now under COVID or war or whatever else, we have to make sure that first of all, we supply with whatever product these are, and we need to reach reasonable price. Again, the question is, what is reasonable price nowadays? I will not address these questions now, but we need to realize the conflict between those beautiful sustainability-oriented objectives and those objectives that you can see from the Treaty of the European Union, which have nothing to do with environment or many of the social aspects that we are thinking about, such as rural vitality. Now, with that, I must say that we've seen repeated reforms not succeeding. In 2014, we evaluated the CAP reform of 2013. We said it's not going to work. 2017, we demonstrated why it didn't work, because it was designed to fail by allowing farmers to choose on ineffective options. We evaluated also the proposal of the Common Agricultural Policy beyond 2020, and we've shown that there is a major bias in terms of budget, in terms of how this is going to be implemented, and we're not very optimistic that this will actually lead to a change. This was unfortunately ignored. The consequence was that scientists decided to go a step further and demonstrate that there are options still ahead of us to improve the Common Agricultural Policy for the benefit of farmers and the environment. And over 3,640 scientists signed a call for action and promoted the idea that we can achieve win-wins for both people and nature. This has resulted in a lot of response from policymakers. It was not ignored, and we have been invited to a range of meetings, and scientists have been engaged in many consultation processes and talking to the ministries and to the Commission, etc. We have been invited to collect recommendations on how to fulfill the biodiversity objectives. And this is not a question whether the CAP should do it, but how it should do it, given that the objective exists. In consequence, scientists were very eager to attend workshops, which were completely voluntary for them, but they saw the opportunity of delivering their knowledge to whoever wants to have this knowledge. There were workshops taking place in 13 member states. There was an online survey where over 300 experts, both scientists and other stakeholders and experts, participated and provided recommendations from 23 member states, which are relevant for all the EU, but also taking into consideration, as Julie was saying, that there is no one size fits all. There are many different situations and problems and many solutions which are local or national. And therefore, we need this knowledge at the right level. From this moment on, I would like to present some of the recommendations that we've collected through the work in the literature, through Project Graze Life, through the workshops and other processes in Project ICAPES, as well as consultations that took place within another initiative called the Birds in Farmland Initiative, where stakeholders were invited to take part in developing conservation schemes for birds. And again, grasslands and grazing were one of the areas which were chosen as a very important area to focus on. So one of the first recommendations that we gave was to clarify the definitions, especially for grasslands, but also for wetlands, to make sure that eligibility criteria are expanded to really meet the needs of the environments that we have, to ensure that the habitat directives are included and covered. And this is particularly relevant for commons, which are not defined, for forests and what forest versus forestry is. Where should we see the grazers, for instance, in our case, but also wood pastures, which is a major issue. I've visited a farmer in the Alps in Austria, which was shown me his area with 800 hectares managed together in a collective, and where the cows are happily grazing in what is defined a wood pasture. We've seen red list species in this environment, and 40% of the area is not eligible for CAP support because wood pastures are excluded from support. Otherwise, it would be too much area, too difficult to control. So I was told by the ministry and relevant people who are responsible for that. So the problem is often that the definitions given by the CAP, given by the EU, are actually good enough, but then member states choose not to define the relevant habitats because it's too complicated for them, or because they say we don't know how to define high nature value farmlands, although the science behind these definitions is pretty clear, and the needs of the farmers or the grazers and the combined benefits there are very clear. So one thing is still, even now, to improve the definitions within the member states. And if they don't accept that, in some cases, the best solution is to take them to court, as it happened in Greece. With enhanced conditionality, there were a range of recommendations. Unfortunately, they were not taken by the European Commission, and I prefer to continue on to remind us and remind ourselves that agri-environment climate measures are the most well-established mechanism with lots of knowledge that is already existing on what works and what doesn't. So the easiest path for improvement is to expand the budgets in agri-environment measures, to enhance the flexibility for farmers to engage in effective farming using the local knowledge which often they have or consultants can provide. We also know from the workshops and from experts and from the literature that we need to upscale to the landscape level to work in collaborative implementation. And this is particularly useful for conservation grazing, where we need to work at the landscape in a larger scales. In many cases, result-based approaches are very useful because they allow farmers, given their knowledge, to actually meet the requirements for biodiversity or climate. They do know how to do that, at least in the case of grassland and grazing. So for conservation grazing, result-based approaches are pretty effective. We've been told, even by ministries, that often when they provide, for instance, the Ministry of Environment provides recommendations to the farmers, and the farmers fulfill these requirements, they can still be sanctioned by the Ministry of Agriculture if there's a conflict between what is good and what is defined as right. And this should not be acceptable. We need to find a way forward where there's a mandate for consultants and other experts, including governmental organizations, to actually define what is really the right management and make sure that farmers are not sanctioned when doing the right thing according to science and knowledge. This should be avoided. And of course, we should reduce administrative burdens by all means, and one of these means can be by applying together for collaborative applications that reduce the amount of applications that farmers have to get in order to get supported. Other recommendations were to move beyond what the EU is defining as organic. We need to call it maybe organic plus, but a lot of good measures for biodiversity and climate, such as pastoralism, which is also perceived traditionally and culturally as an important measure, and other forms of extensive management, or cases where the animals are basically roaming in areas which might be under conventional agriculture. They're not eligible for support under organic because they feed on the wrong food. So we need to look into sustainability in a more broader scale of it, and to generate the entrance options for small herders or other extensive farmers to make sure that organic follows also definitions in other parts of the world where biodiversity is really included. So it's not only about pesticide use, etc., but really about sustainability in general. That's why I call it organic plus. It does not really exist in a full farm in Europe, and this is an opportunity that is still there ahead of us. Direct payments are taking a very large proportion of the common agricultural policy, and particularly coupled payments could be used in an effective way. In Germany, actually, as an example, they are using this for these payments to support extensive farming in some cases, but otherwise in most member states, in most situations, direct payments are an elephant in the room, which is used for purposes which we don't even have a way to trace, and they might need to be phased out completely. Areas of nature constraints will receive by now only 50% of the allocation to environment, but we don't know what actually this means. So what we still need to do is to evaluate how they perform and to make sure that member states, when they are implementing, are sharpening the objectives, the targets, and receive and use good guidelines on how to improve the use of this important measure. Let's recall that the definitions used by the EU are actually such that 57% of agricultural areas fall into the category of areas of nature constraints. So member states have a lot of flexibility, maybe too much flexibility on how they use this instrument. So Alliance Environment defined this instrument as direct payments in Pillar 2. So either you move it to Pillar 1 or you improve and target it. We do have also the opportunity to make much better use of the knowledge systems of the CAP, and I think there are lots of opportunities evolving even nowadays for bottom-up initiatives to grow and to expand. And there I see also the role of institutions and organizations such as Wild Europe or Euronature to actually do that, Euronatur. I'm coming now to eco schemes. This is an important instrument, but a new instrument. We don't know whether it will succeed or not. We do know that we need to make sure that it succeeds because there's a great opportunity in there, but we also need to see what was submitted by the member states. The recommendations by experts and other scientists and other experts were to make sure that they are evidence-based and are used to protect, but also to restore non-productive landscape features to reach the 10% where it's missing, or even beyond 10% where it's already existing and we need not to lose the non-productive land. And in grasslands, this is equally important. Sheep and cows need shade as well, and we need to make sure that extensive permanent grasslands are protected, but we also need to extensify. We need to find a way to restore wetlands, particularly for climate reasons, and we need to make sure that habitat quality is really measured and that we are succeeding in improving it. Through the combined use of eco schemes and agro-environmental measures, we have the opportunity potentially to top up one another and to make sure that farmers that really do so benefit more. That's why they also need to be attractive, relatively simple. Simplicity is probably not what we're going to see ahead of us in the coming years, but we need to strive for that. And particularly because eco schemes are annual, we will need to see how we can help farmers doing it continuously and applying repeatedly because it's attractive and because it's useful for them and for the environment. Because otherwise, a lot of beneficial measures which take time to develop, such as succession or habitat quality, such as in grassland areas, will take time to evolve. So if they employ that only for 1 year, we don't see the benefits of such an implementation. In this sense, there are many risks in eco schemes, and we have to make sure that we're not falling into these. I'd like to close with where we're currently standing now. The reality is that by now, a lot of the recommendations which were given by the scientists and by many other organizations have been either ignored or watered down. The strategic plans have been submitted, partly using our evaluations. They have been evaluated also by BirdLife and EEB, but also others. The European Commission also wrote very clear letters saying that member states are not ambitious enough. Nevertheless, they're being approved by the Commission, sometimes without any revision or a minor revision. And we are seeing that if you look at the map of Europe, grassland management is included in most member states. Second most important eco schemes, but they're not good enough. So the map of Europe does not look very promising in terms of grasslands, but also other means of evaluating eco schemes and the strategic plans. So what we're seeing now is that there's already an upcoming missed opportunity of actually using eco schemes simply to replace the diluted conditionality by exempting many environments, including now pressure on GAEC 1, for instance. In addition, we have a war in Ukraine. This is not only a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, but also a shock for food, feed, and energy systems. This is a global shock, which some environmental organizations are extremely concerned about. Some social organizations are particularly worried about, but it is being used in a very cynical way to drive counterproductive decisions by policymakers. And we are seeing a lot of pressure currently into, we need to produce more, we need to intensify, we need to put aside environmental regulations. We've seen that it has taken 2 weeks from the beginning of the war until a derogation was taken on ecological focus areas, basically saying we cannot allow it, we need to produce more. But fallow land are taking a marginal area in usually very low productive area, whereas the majority of agricultural area in the EU is used for feed and fuel. So there are huge opportunities of using the land much more effectively, and we are not doing so. So policymakers are taking counterproductive decisions at the moment under pressure to produce more, although we have much better solutions than doing so. And the same goes for other decisions that have already been taken to actually take a derogation on conditionality and non-productive land, for instance, for the year 2023, and shifting budgets from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1 to support agrochemical inputs, fertilizer use, and feed production. Feed production is no solution for food security, of course, but it's still sold as such. And this is not a situation which is very easy for scientists to see, particularly because we are seeing the size of the combined crisis that we are facing at the moment. So if anything, at the moment, we really need to strengthen the nature restoration law, the Green Deal, etc., to make sure that we are not targeting one crisis and driving the rest of the crisis forward. What we're really seeing from this situation is most member states are not ambitious. So the fact that there's a lot of flexibility for member states to implement good measures does not mean that they're not going to do that. On the contrary, we're expecting that they will not do that. Question is what we can do about that. And I think at the moment, we are usually focusing on the margins of the problem. We have subsidies that we could improve, agro-environmental measures, eco schemes. We have some measures which could be improved with indirect payments. We have clearly harmful subsidies such as coupled payments, but still the biggest element in there is the support for business as usual farming, partly canceling the impacts of other measures. And this is a counterproductive situation where the balance between investments for the environment, for conservation grazing, for good farming is still losing in investments into business as usual, unsustainable farming. And this is particularly critical in the case of conservation grazing if the aim is to maintain extensive grasslands. The media seems to show us a very polarized debate. There's a lot of lobby pressure, there's a lot of misinformation and misrepresentation. There's a lot of complexity when it comes to grazing in particular, and meat and dairy product use, and whether we're doing that because of ideological reasons or not. But a lot of this conflict is portrayed as such by interest groups that want to make sure that the CAP is not touched and that we are continuing business as usual, whereas the reality, based on science, based on surveys, based on the number of people, if you simply analyze them, is that the majority of people are interested in seeing sustainable farming ahead of us. And conservation grazing is one of the opportunities we do have, and we need to strengthen and reduce the complexity for people who don't understand or don't know what are the opportunities ahead. So what can we do? We can all be more proactive. We can offer help, given that the CAP is really not easy, given that the situation for farmers is not easy. So there is complexity in it, and we can accept and help it. We can use the science more effectively to moderate or reduce these conflicts that we are seeing in a situation which is polarized, in a situation which is difficult. We should look for the win-wins, but also acknowledge that there are trade-offs. In this case, ask where are the ways to compensate when they exist. But we will also find a way to address the problem of misinformation and misunderstandings of what types of grazing, what types of meat or dairy products, for instance, are sustainable. And this is not simple. So we need to find a way to better communicate, to find the right narratives that would work for a larger number of people, including both farmers and the broader society, to reduce the risk ahead of us, even for food security, given the combined crisis of climate crisis, biodiversity, soil erosion, etc. We can also participate in various initiatives such as citizen science to help collecting the data that we need on what are the impacts of different measures. And we could also be clear in placing demands for policymakers and others to actually do some evidence-based policy, to use the science which is there instead of wasting the many millions that are invested in producing knowledge, which is then ignored, and also act now and not wait and allow the crisis to worsen, and act in transparency. Last but not least, I think it's our role, each of us as individuals or as organizations, to develop a broader vision, take out what can we take from the future beyond 2027, beyond the CAP. I think we need a farm to fork policy, not just a strategy. The Green Deal is a nice idea, but it's a strategy. There's an attempt now to establish a nature restoration law. Likely it will be strongly watered down by the Parliament and the Council, as we expect and as we see in other situations. But I think we also need to put the budgets where they belong. We need a fund for nature, especially if we're asking farmers to take their land out of production or reduce significantly. Then we're talking about a situation which is beyond the CAP. If we're not talking about farming, but we're talking about restoring, rewilding, re-wetting, then we're taking land out of production. This needs a direct management of these funds and direct governance, not around through farming organizations or other lobby problems, but rather direct governance to make sure that we are really addressing the problems with the right instruments. National legislation is particularly important as well for the complex situations in different countries, but we also have to look at the consumer side. The demand side is particularly relevant in the case of meat and dairy products. If the demands for meat and dairy requirements are so high, then if you extensify, you will really shoot out your users into other parts of the world. And this is a problem as well. So we make sure that we enhance the visibility of farmers, but also address the consumer side. And once this is done for rural vitality and for everybody, I think we'll have to explore the options beyond the CAP and potentially ending the CAP if there's no reform ahead of us. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I think it's time for a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's an enormous challenge ahead of us to make agriculture more environment and climate friendly. And your presentation really makes me not very optimistic about the possibilities to change the current situation and make agriculture really more friendly towards climate and towards environment, but also to establish the link between land use and the sustainable land use, the halting the degradation of biodiversity. And if I understand you well, it basically comes down to the what is called the EU treaty, and what is stated there about agriculture and the importance of producing sufficient food and having low prices for food and that environment and especially also climate are no issues mentioned in the treaty. and possibly that is one of the reasons why the CAP doesn't really address the real challenges. But I have a lot of questions coming from both your presentations. First of all, for those who joined our webinar a bit later, we have 2 presentations instead of the 3 that were announced previously, because Jure had to cancel his presentation due to personal circumstances. So we have a bit more time for the discussion. And there are some questions already in the Q&A box. And well, Bill is very active. I see Bill Grayson in asking questions. And if there are more people who have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. The first question is, I would say, is it maybe a very practical one, and especially for Julia, is, and you have seen it maybe, Julia, is what are the negative effects of extensive grazing on biodiversity?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's not that straightforward, since when I talked about extensive grazing in my research and in my presentation, then often the studies that talk about extensive grazing, they don't really describe the intensity of grazing with livestock unit in any ways. So it's hard to say what they mean with extensive grazing. They just usually compare intensive, which is the quite high density of animals, and then extensive, which is lower density, but still quite close to what commercial livestock grazing can be. And then in these cases, it is still relatively intensive, and then the impact that it can have on biodiversity are the same than that with intensive grazing. That can be impact on biodiversity, soil organic carbon, too high disturbance, soil erosion, and so on. And I think if you think about really extensive grazing, where really the animal density is so that there is no need for external feed input, and that the area is sufficiently large with sufficiently small number of animals, then I would say there is basically almost no negative impact on biodiversity. It's really mostly positive, especially in environments that have co-evolved with grazers like grassland. But I think it's not that often that you have this type of systems where animals are really sufficiently few, so that they're supported by the system only, and without need to like import additional feed or take them in for the winter because there is not enough pasture space, and so on. I hope that answered your question, Bill.
Well, Bill had to leave.
Okay.
So he can't answer that question.
Okay.
But
no, I saw his message.
But it was a fruitful and very clear answer, Julia. So thanks for that. There's a question from Adrienne Guillen. I hope I pronounce it correctly. And she says there's a tendency that the EU tries to push back animal husbandry because, to push back animal husbandry due to the impact to the emission of greenhouse gases. And that is an interesting question. How that is the relation between conservation grazing and husbandry to greenhouse gas emissions, and maybe also to the soil organic matter. You referred to that already, but broadly the relation between the climate change impacts of conservation grazing and husbandry.
Yeah, maybe I can take this one too. I think it's interesting, this idea that maybe livestock grazing has bad reputation, also with a very good reason. And I think it's important to differentiate conservation grazing and maybe livestock grazing that has the purpose to provide food, often dairy or meat, and where you're often trying to maximize the output of meat, whether it's in breed selection or if you're going to fertilize pasture, import feed, and that has a very different impact than conservation grazing, where even if sometimes you still have food output from that, the goal is conservation. So it is going to be to conserve the landscape, to have a positive impact, and also to not have overgrazing issues and so on. So I think the key is really to think about differentiating these two types of grazing, and also have the availability of information on the impact of these different systems in terms of greenhouse gas emission, and also having in the back of our mind that the amount of meat that can be provided with conservation grazing is extremely low. And it's important to think about that there is too much livestock grazing, there is too much meat consumption, there is too much dairy consumption. And I think it's about having a bit the priorities of, okay, do we want landscapes that are managed by grazers that are beneficial for the landscapes, or do we want to have as many cattle units or as many livestock units as possible to produce food? And then I think the impact on greenhouse gas is very different. And I think this concept of less but better meat is important, and it is when we think about that, and if we think about greenhouse gas, it would be a lot less meat that could be made while having a sustainable level of greenhouse gases.
Would you like to add something, Kai?
Yes, I'll be happy to add something directly taking from what Julia was saying. I think we have to look at, first of all, land. How is land being used? And the general problem we have is that we're trying to maintain our current consumption levels, and we're putting consequently more and more pressure on land. And particularly now with the energy crisis, we're adding one more component, which is pressing on land. So the consequence is that whenever you're talking about conservation grazing or extensive grazing, then you say, well, we cannot allow that because food security. In reality, if we look at the numbers, then it's the minority of land which is used or minority of food which is coming from extensively used landscapes. So we're talking about less than 10% of the meat and dairy products which are coming from extensive grazing. And it is correct to say that extensive grazing cannot, or livestock grazing cannot feed the world. If we now shift all our grazing in the world into extensive grazing, obviously we will need so much space to feed all humans. It will have to cut all the rest of the jungles, which are already being cut to feed our animals. So obviously the problem is being hijacked very easily towards, well, you cannot allow yourself that because consumption. So it's easy to throw the problem at consumption. And that's why also the definition should be very clear. What is the purpose of using the land? So if the purpose is conservation grazing, that it means this land is designated toward good management. One of the most pressed environments are grasslands in Europe and globally because they have too intensive use. They're not only intensively used in terms of animals, but also fertilizers. And so the IPCC was very clear saying that methane in general, because it is staying in the atmosphere for such a short term, is actually the best way forward in reducing our emissions. So the IPCC was hinting very strongly and actually writing very clearly that the best way forward in reducing our impacts, environmental impact and climate impact, is to reduce the number of grazers. That means that our aim should be to consume less and to allow conservation grazing to expand, and not to say, well, we need to shift all the grazing in the world or all the animals towards happy grazers, because this is not the reality. So we have to think, where are we doing intensive management, where our animals in stalls are not relevant for conservation purposes, And where are we designated land for better management, for climate, biodiversity, etc. And I think both sides of production and consumption need to be taken into consideration here.
Yes, yes, thank you. And in addition to that, and I think you referred to that in your talk as well, is the maybe there's a kind of fluent border between extensive grazing and extensive agriculture and conservation grazing. What is one of the challenges is that, of course, one of the ecosystem services provided by extensive or conservation grazing is meat. And in the current eco certification schemes, biodiversity is not included. And it would be nice to have an eco certification scheme that includes also whether the meat has been produced in a biodiverse, positive way. And not because you see a lot of new labels coming on the market that say, okay, we have produced in a nature-friendly way, but why a new eco label while there is basically an eco label, and improve that current label, so you have the possibility also to look at not only biodiversity but also climate, for instance, and have that in one eco label.
Maybe to reflect on what you just said, which I think is important for those who are not experts of the common agricultural policy, to understand that there are actually opportunities ahead of us, and some of them will likely be used by member states to improve the situation. So eco schemes, most member states listed extensive permanent grasslands as one of the options. And this can be used, especially if we're mapping what you call ecologically sensitive permanent grasslands, and better use of the maps that are existing of high nature value farmland. We could use the combination of eco schemes and agro-environmental measures to improve grassland quality, to improve habitat quality, and to support conservation grazing. The problem is that the amount of money which is allocated by member states and the way they design the eco schemes is such that they will not expand, they will not extensify, but merely find hopefully sufficient money for those farmers that are struggling at the moment maintaining extensive grasslands already. So it is an improvement for those that are already engaged in extensive grazing, that they will be better compensated for that or supported for that, but it is unlikely to reach the aim of extensifying a larger number of landscapes which are currently under too much pressure or disappearing due to intensification. And this is the problem that we have. The other instrument, which is what you mentioned as eco schemes or labels, are not an instrument within the common agricultural policy. If the European Parliament and the Commission come up with proposals and implement them, they could do it at any time now. So the improvement of labeling, communication to consumers, etc., or starting to finally tell consumers as well, look, we have to consume less, needs to start now. And even myself as a consumer, when I go to the supermarket or to any other place, it's very hard when I see the label of, okay, this is organic. I don't see labels which are really sustainable and I can trust. And if informed consumers are not able to inform themselves when they buy something, then obviously any interested citizen in supporting these kind of measures is not capable of doing so. And so we need to empower citizens in knowing that they eat the right thing and understanding how much power there's in the hands of each of us. If we just reduce the amount of meat, reduce the amount of milk, and try to shift towards extensive but less, as Julia formulated it, less but better meat, less antibiotics in that, less deworming agents, more landscapes, more biodiversity and butterflies and birds, and happier farmers that need this support. Shortening the value chains and making sure that the farmer really gets a good payment for what they produce is also important. And again, this is not a mechanism that exists in the CAP. There are no instruments in the CAP. So again, there's a gap to fill in terms of which instruments we are going to develop in the coming years to ensure that we address the needs of both the producers and the consumers. But this is a set of different instruments and therefore also many entry points and opportunities ahead of us if we're using the knowledge in a better way.
Thank you. I get the sun in my eyes. I will read a comment and a question from Dr. Nicholas Skolf. And she states that the changes in the CAP were of great significance for extensive grazing and the Flora and Fauna and Habitat Directive. And this change is that grazing livestock farmers could now receive funding for habitats and even species that are mentioned within the directives. Unfortunately, she says, I still lack any idea how this can be implemented administratively. And it would be purposeful, she says, if your organization would collaborate on possible solutions. It is certainly important to criticize the CAP principle, but that will not get us anywhere in the coming years. So research and NGOs must also become more involved in the implementation of the CAP. Yes, we would like that. And the habitat backdrops are often not known. Farmers are not able to identify, for example, the bristlegrass grassland in terms of location and in terms that they have enough people and capacities and knowledge to do the mapping. I think, she says, for now, farmers should be advised not to use the scheme because of the potential sanctions. That's quite a strong statement. Any comment to that, Guy or Julia?
I'd like to thank you for this intervention. I think it's important to realize that there are always entry points, there are opportunities, and the existence of eco schemes does offer this opportunity, and particularly for conservation grazing. So if I'm criticizing the CAP, this is because of the will to improve, but also to try to realize that by being more aware of the instruments, we could do better also as scientists, as NGOs, as interested people in supporting those that really need support. The majority of farmers in surveys, etc., are typically environmentally friendly and want to do good, and they want to be supported in doing good. And in this sense, one of the win-wins ahead of us, which I think can be developing quite rapidly, and all the instruments are there, are for collaborative implementation. Groups of farmers that will apply for funding on larger area to implement exactly what we need, with what we know that could be done. This will actually be done also within, we will explore that in the new project Agroecology Transect, which has started in September. It's a Horizon Europe project where we're going to look into these kind of questions, how to upscale successes and how to use the instruments wisely so that we do see the expansion using the opportunities ahead of us. I also mentioned citizen science because indeed it's a question of how we get people to be more informed and not necessarily informed by somebody else telling them what to do, which is very arrogant. In many cases, the farmers know equally or even better than me or any other experts what to do, but they need to be able to demonstrate that they have, for instance, the rare species on their landscape. So in one case that I exemplified before, I went to the landscape and literally took pictures of the habitat directive species on the land. But once this is done, a farmer can do that as well. And so we could empower farmers to collect more data or to assess how they are affecting their environment so that they can come up with that and demonstrate that they do it. The question of sanctions, which you mentioned, is indeed a problem, and many farmers are indeed deterred from taking agro-environmental measures. And in this sense, also from the GrazeLife interviews, that was a major topic which scientists and NGOs are probably happy to help. But if the experts are not given the mandate to say this is good management, it should be supported, or there's no reason to sanction a farmer if doing the right thing. So they can get approvals for exemptions, for instance, of doing too early mowing or too late mowing or whatever other management actions which make no sense in a given time or a given place. Then we need to work together to help them in being empowered to do the right things. So thank you for this intervention. I think it's very useful that we highlighted that there are opportunities and there's a lot of goodwill among the farmers.
Thank you, Guy. And there's other question, I think that is for you, and that is the question whether the loss of small farms, which has a big impact also on landscape and biodiversity in Central and Eastern Europe, will the speed of the loss will be reduced through the new CAP, so that we will be able to maintain more small farm holders through the new CAP. And that is a question from Irena Bertonzai. Can you reflect on that?
The frank answer is I don't know. We can remain optimistic that it will. Some experts evaluated that with eco schemes, the amount of money towards potentially useful biodiversity and climate measures, we may have an increase up to 6 times larger than the current capacities. I'm not sure about the exact numbers. Some people say only double, but it depends. The capacities in new member states to support good measures is often limited. And so when it comes to small farmers, it's really a matter of how the member states will be using this money. And therefore, we will need to observe, particularly with the war, a lot of money was shifted now even more strongly from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1. So it was used as an opportunity to support production. Production usually means larger farmers taking over and producing more. So the problem is a global problem. It's not because of the CAP. We are seeing the loss of small farmers because it's hard to compete. Extensive grazing is less competitive to intensive one. So these are not CAP related problems. And this is a problem also in many new member states. They still see the outcomes of land centralization or land, loss of farmers because very few organizations and companies are taking over. And this is unfortunately not something which is easy to resolve. I think we are already on the stabilizing part of this situation, but on the other hand, high nature valley farmlands, for instance, have been disappearing really fast and continuing to disappear even now. So this is exactly the question back to the NGOs, back to the experts at the national level. How much can you support effective use of these fundings in the coming years to make sure that those farmers that need support receive it? So it's a question back to everybody. How can we make sure it happens rather than a prediction of what's going to happen?
Yes, thank you. Well, one of the problems is, as I see it, and you pointed at that, is the communication aspect. We have seen it here in the Netherlands, where huge amounts of protest have been ongoing because farmers have been taking the streets and the roads to protest against the policies of the Dutch government. And it basically boils down to not properly communicating what are the objectives, the long-term objectives, and what are also the perspectives of the farmers in the future, and how do we change the farming system towards a more sustainable farming system that protects climate and biodiversity, and also provide insight in what will be the place of farming in the future and food production in general. So communication is a very big problem, and establish good communication is a clear challenge. There is it's Tiana who would like to say something. Wojtek, can you give the floor to Tiana so she can intervene? Meanwhile, there's a remark from Roya Kutniak, and she says, or he, that she got the impression that conservation grazing and extensive grazing are synonyms. Yeah, maybe you can reflect on that. But
yeah, I think extensive grazing is just, it can be any type of grazing. It's just that we consider that there are less animals maybe on the same surface, whereas conservation grazing, I think, has often the idea that it has objectives of maintaining the environment, contributing to biodiversity protection, and so on. So I think in the end, it can correspond to the same grazing density, but maybe the format of it can be different because the objectives of it is different. And as for the second part of the question about intensive grazing being used as conservation grazing, I think in some cases it can be beneficial to have intensive grazing for a very short amount of time. So this is basically the effect that you have when you do pastoralist management, where you move through the landscape a very like a flock of sheep who are many individuals, and they will eat a lot, but for a very short amount of time. So this kind of very short and intense disturbance, not continuous over time, can be interesting for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I think in these cases it can be used for conservation grazing.
thank you. Yeah, there is indeed, of course, no clear border between them, but you could also say that conservation grazing is managed by a conservation organization, and extensive grazing is from the perspective of the farmer.
Yeah.
So Tiana, if you unmute yourself, you can make your intervention.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, I'm very sorry if you hear some crying. I'm with the kids, so no. Thank you very much for this very helpful presentation and with a lot of information. I'm coming from Serbia, and we are working on one site where we are going to establish extensive conservation grazing, and the thing with Serbia is that we do not have agroecological measures, and recently we tried to identify a feature in the landscape intensively used for agricultural production landscape, natural and semi-natural features that could serve as a surrogates for let's say some of the measures. We selected a group of 5 group of measures, and we tried to identify the surrogates, and the analysis show that even those natural and semi-natural area are quite important for bird related to grasslands area, and one species specialist, grassland, small mammal grassland species specialist. And now we are just thinking how to work and develop any suggestion to stakeholders, how to inform them better what they should adapt from EU, because there are plans and programs, and we need to fit to EU regulatives and policies, especially when the Chapter 27 will be opened at some point. And I think those all presented is quite valuable for us. So it's not that I do have a question. I just, on the other hand, want to point out that we have another issue. We have problem with the conversion of grasslands, publicly owned state grasslands to arable land. And we cannot stop it. It's illegal activities, but then it's jeopardizing again the biodiversity, and we are quite concerned. So that's somehow, let's say, the situation in our country.
Thanks a lot, Tiana. Yeah, there's not really a question.
No, I don't have a question, because everything what they say is quite useful, because we can use it as arguments, because they are like very detailed study from EU. We do have arguments about what is important in the landscape, but then how to put that on table, we will have to see. Like it's like something that we should work on. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
thank you. Maybe
if I may reply very shortly,
yes,
just maybe to highlight a point which is maybe useful also for attendants of this webinar who are not necessarily from the EU. There are a range of instruments beyond the CAP in many countries, and one of them, which is very central, is compensation measures. So mining companies, other companies, transportation, whatever, they have to put aside money for compensation of their damages under the no net loss or whatever other definitions. Many member states, if not, well, sorry, maybe many countries globally are putting this money aside. And this is one opportunity for maintaining and restoring landscapes. In the UK, we also see the consequence of Brexit. At least one thing positive is the decision to phase out direct payments and really to invest in public money for public goods as an approach for payments. So there are many opportunities ahead also in terms of what are the funding mechanisms, including public-private cooperation companies, etc. And I'm not talking about greenwashing, but I'm talking about situations where you really can use goodwill and to work together towards solutions. So I think the intervention you made, Tiana, is very valuable also for people that think beyond the CAP and beyond the EU. So yeah, maybe I would like to use the floor also to invite a reply to the question of soils. I think it's a very good question on soils. At least in communicating with farmers, we've noticed that if there are really things that farmers understand and that broader society understands is soil. You know, that's where food is coming from. It's Mother Earth, it's Mother Nature. So when we communicate with farmers, actually, it's not about butterflies or birds. It's really about soil degradation and soil quality, water quality. So if there's too much grazing, as we've already heard from Julia, then there are problems of nutrients, of pollution, etc. So the soil is where food security comes from and where our production is there. And so I think it's the reconnection of people to nature and people to the resources of our safety net of production is very central, I think, in making a step forward and reducing tensions. But maybe Julia has something to add on the issues you found in terms of soil.
No, but how I understood the question is how to reconnect people to the soil. And I guess you talked about how farmers are actually very connected to the soil and they are very knowledgeable about it. And I think the rest of the general population maybe doesn't think about it as much. And I think we've been talking a couple of times about labeling and certification. And I think healthy soil should be taken into consideration when having any kind of labeling of something being from sustainable grazing or from conservation grazing, since it's incredibly important, and grazing has the potential to affect soil parameters very heavily and very negatively in case of overgrazing.
Yeah. So I think we need to come to an end of this webinar. I from a perspective of a manager of a protected area, there was one remark from you, Guy, that struck me. You said that the direct payments are relevant for extensive farming, which then I concluded, so direct payments cannot be used for conservation grazing.
Direct payments can be used for anything. That's exactly the strength and weakness in an instrument which has no actual objective. Direct payments were installed from the first place as an instrument to support farming during the 90s when there were major reforms of the CAP, but they can be used for anything. And the consequence is that conventional farming is used as the majority of the farming forms, but also extensive grazing. So a farmer that has area beyond the minimum eligible area, so 10 hectares usually, can apply for direct payments based on hectares. And so it's the farmer decision whether to use it for conservation grazing and put a low number of animals, or to use it for intensive grazing or conventional in any form. So definitely direct payments are an instrument which could be used for conservation grazing. It's just that normally it's not what is happening.
And a conservation organization cannot apply.
Correct.
It's not
the other
considered
issue,
a
thank you
farming.
for refining this issue. Anybody, including land users and NGOs, can apply for Pillar 2 payments. But for Pillar 1 payment, there was a big struggle, and farm lobbies ensured that only farmers will be eligible to submit applications for direct payments, including also eco schemes. So NGOs or other organizations that are not defined as farmers, genuine farmers as you call them, are not eligible for direct payments. Nevertheless, we do see that there are loopholes in there. So a lot of companies are receiving direct payments. So I would say that there's a lot of problem of leakages of money from direct payments to other directions, particularly actually just the price of the land. So most of the farmers, for instance, in Germany, or also land users, are simply renting this land. And that means that the money is going from direct payments simply to rent the land you're on. This is reducing a lot of possibilities to what you could do if you want to restore. You're depending on the owner. So a lot of complexities, which I'm not sure that are the place to discuss at the end of our discussion, but thank you for refining the issue that direct payments were secluded in the same way that now also payments for forest holders in the new CAP, only farmers and foresters can apply for them. So they were excluded. NGOs have been excluded from a range of instruments in the new CAP.
Yeah.
So that's a problem that we do see.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much for this clarification. And I think we have to close our webinar at the moment. So once again, Julia and Guy, thanks a lot. Maybe because it would have been interesting to see how in Slovenia the linkage between agricultural practices and the CAP and conservation management somehow is being integrated in the action plan. But maybe we will organize an additional webinar on that if Jure is also willing to do that. So if you have more questions, please feel free to drop us an email, either at info@eurosite.org or directly to me. You are free to become also a member of our working group, the management, conservation management working group, and to contribute to our toolkit on management of conservation sites. So for the moment, I think that's it. Once again, thank you very much for participating in this webinar. I found it very interesting and I learned a lot of new things, and I hope that counts for you as well. So thank you very much, and see you maybe next time. And remember, there will be another webinar on the 27th of September. Thank you. Bye-bye.